Hello and welcome to Sam and Matt's 20th Century, Episode 2, Year 2, 1901. JP Morgan and the foundation of US Steel.
Which is the first billion-dollar company in the history of the world. Biggest company ever made up to that point in time.
Heard it here first. I'm Sam.
And I'm Matt.
And Matt is, to all intents and purposes today, the historian. Matt is, we can only hope by this point, an expert on all things US Steel, on some things JP Morgan, on some things JS Morgan. Do you want to introduce it, Matt? Just talk about why this is important. Why do we care about this US Steel company?
The Morgan family turned up in New England in the mid-1700s, originally from a Welsh family, which we can both, hence the Morgan, which we can both sympathise with.
All roads their lead.
And the man that really takes the Morgan name to new heights is J.P. Morgan's dad, J.S. Morgan. Junius Spencer Morgan had a fantastic taste for names, this family. J.S. Morgan goes overseas. He goes away from the little New York Yankee firm. They'd always been bankers. The family had always been bankers.
So they're quite well moneyed.
They're moneyed. They're an old moneyed American family. Yeah. Junius Spencer Morgan takes this and goes over to London. And he does this with another guy called George Peabody, who is quite famous.
Yeah, do you want to introduce his character? This is something that stood out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Reading the original draft.
A really interesting little bit of history. I think the collective consciousness. If you've heard of George Peabody, you'll have heard of him for his philanthropic works. Things like the Peabody Estate was incredibly important in the sort of 1870s and 1880s to build better, cheap tenement housing to replace the slums of London. But earlier on in his life, in his career, George Peabody was really an absolutely infamous Scrooge. He would wait in the rain when he was very old and very rich. He'd wait in the rain for 1 penny buses to come along rather than get, let alone a cab, rather than get more expensive bus fares. He'd wait for the cheapest,
for the 1 penny version.
1 penny bus, the very cheapest. And this is a man with sort of about £1.5 million in personal wealth.
I mean, the sums involved in this game.
He's
like period in time is ludicrous.
The ultimate real life Scrooge. He's Ebenezer Scrooge made flesh.
So he and JS are in London. What do they do?
Within London and within the merchant banking scene, you have these old, venerable firms, these old families, people who are still relatively well known today. The Rothschilds, the Barings, families that date back their banking heritage to the medieval.
Yeah, I mean, you described Morgan as old money, but this is old.
This is
money.
really old money, and there's a really, really interesting kind of a dynamic with these people. They're like the financiers to nation states, kings, sultans. Something that comes up in our A-level history course is
Disraeli goes to the Rothschilds.
Disraeli goes to the Rothschilds in order to raise, I think it's a £3.5 million loan.
Yeah, in order to buy
shares in the Suez Canal, and he basically just takes a loan on behalf of the British government from this family.
Oh yeah, I love that. So they're the family you go to. You're a government in need. You've got a war you want to finance.
Yeah, the Rothschilds alone around this time had were financially servicing the governments. Turkey, Germany, Spain, Italy, Russia. And the thing is that because Britain is so powerful in terms of a global empire, so all of these City of London-based firms are really running the world from a financial perspective.
Okay, so that's where you want to be.
The fates of entire nations rest on the money that pours in and out of the firms of Rothschild and Baring and places like that. And so into these hallowed, ancient, this twilight world, world comes Peabody and Morgan, who are Americans.
Yeah,
upstarts. And no one likes these upstarts because, especially at the time, around the time of the Civil War, there are all sorts of states that are just defaulting on loans left, right and centre. America, at this point, is not very well trusted from a kind of fiscal responsibility.
Well, I mean, it's only been so long since they weren't part of
absolutely.
someone else's empire entirely.
So they're not viewed very kindly by the majority. But what this allows Junius Spencer Morgan, particularly JS, he does a few little slightly dirty backhand deals.
Such as?
Well, here we get to refer back to the last episode.
Yep.
And
okay.
The Franco-Prussian War. As Sam put it last week, France was fighting a war against a much better equipped, more efficient Prussian army under the chairmanship of Bismarck. And they basically ran out of money. They didn't have any money. They had no way to fight the war. They had no way to win the war. The Prussians were coming in and they were going to besiege Paris, and it was all going to be awful.
Yeah, and certainly in terms of France was still something of a pariah. Germany is the favoured state. It's the more popular,
and this
one.
This is shown in those old venerable firms of the city, because the Rothschilds and the Barings both had a conflict of interest that meant they couldn't finance the French because they were both financing the Germans in the war.
Yeah.
Morgan, J.S. Morgan, sees this opportunity and says, "Oh well, I think I'll make a little bit of money here."
Yeah.
So what he does is he agrees to float bonds for the French government, and I'll just do a little bit of
by all means, yeah.
basic economic explanation. A bond is an IOU. So the French government gives J.S. Morgan £100 worth of IOU. Let's just make that as a I owe you £100. I owe you £100. And in response, Morgan then goes away and sells these bonds off, sells these IOUs, and then gives the money to the French government so they have money, funnily enough, to buy American arms. But, you know, that's business for you. So the thing about this deal is it was a little bit cheeky, because he basically gets the IOUs for cheap. So the IOUs are worth £100, let's say, but he only pays about £85 for them.
It does seem to be true of most things in this era, like going back to Disraeli buying the Suez Canal shares. That was basically a case of his personal opportunism, just going to the Rothschilds, say, we might as well, you know, it wasn't... It seems to be a time and a place where the most important things were done shadily between one man and another gentleman.
And just some guy deciding he was going to do this. And as a result of that, when France gets its affairs back in order and starts paying off the IOUs, by the time all of that process is finished, the Morgan firm has made a profit of £1.8 million off the back of the French government, which in those days is a hell of a lot of money.
I mean, God knows what that'd be with inflation added.
Yeah, as previously stated, the pound sterling were the top currency, as the dollar was to sort of the 20th century. So yeah, this is kind of looking at how the Morgan family and how the Morgan firm, kind of the ethic of it, is interesting, because it's got all of this old world pretensions of like this great prestigious trade.
Being in London
and financing these countries, literal nation states, and yet it's got a little bit of sort of new world, underhand, slightly shady dealings. It's not quite as respectable maybe as those old, ancient, century-old firms.
So take us back to JP then. How did he pick up this mantle of his father's, this great profiteering?
Well, the thing about banking is that it so often goes down the family line, because you need to be able to trust a bank, and if you trusted the father, you trust the son. Yeah, there's all kinds of like.
Especially if they've got the same first name.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Rothschilds and other firms like that were very reliant on strong, direct, linear, following father to son to father to son to father to son. And that's what builds a strong merchant bank, because your customers trust you. As a very young man, JP was sort of groomed by his dad to fulfill this role of being a banker. And there are all sorts of little anecdotes about how, you know, he, from a very young age, had this keen financial sense. There's a very adorable story about him making a diorama of Christopher Columbus landing on America and charging his family a few cents to come and see it.
So you
How
say adorable, I say slightly scary.
Yeah, quite scary, but it's sort of pointed to as, oh, look, he has his father's keen sense of financial sort of acumen. But a slightly more scary, even than that, tale of his relative youth was during the Civil War. They paid a substitute, some random guy who lived in the Union, to take J.P. Morgan's place in the Union Army, and they paid him $300 and said, off you go, you're going to fight for me. Nice work, take my place in the draft. And it's just phenomenally strange idea, and it led a lot towards the draft riots that happened towards the end of the Civil War that sort of undermined the Union's power. Later on in life, J.P. Morgan would talk about the other J.P. Morgan who may or may not have died for me during the Civil War. Blimey. Oh, isn't that fun?
Well, I suppose it's inherent though, isn't it? In the study of these inverted commas great men, there were practices that were standard then that you can't help but look on and say, how could they do that?
People that I've mentioned earlier on the podcast, John D. Rockefeller did it, Andrew Carnegie did it. They all paid substitutes to take their place in the draft and to fight in the Civil War on their behalf. There's a phenomenally horrific quote from a man called James Mellon, I believe, who was another sort of like another rich father-son. I don't know what actual industry they were in, but he said, "A man may be a patriot without risking his own life or sacrificing his health. There are plenty lives less valuable," which is just, dearie me. Well,
there you go again. Just some people are not very nice.
Some people are not very nice, but it was also relatively common practice at the time, which is just bizarre. So also during the Civil War, we get a really phenomenal little anecdote of relatively young J.P. Morgan's business acumen. You have a warehouse in New York that holds government surplus old Hall rifles, or old Hall carbines. There's 5,000 of them. And this young New York businessman called Simon Stevens decides he's going to buy up the rifles, he's going to modernise them, and he's going to sell them back to the Union Army in order to, it's a business transaction. So JP Morgan is quite heavily involved with this deal. He finances it, he gives the money, and he's quite involved in the dealing to actually sell the rifles back. But the fun bit comes when you look at the numbers. They buy the rifles originally at $3.50 per rifle. They then modernise them, which it costs not that much, because basically all you're doing is rifling the barrel, where you put like a drill, like a screw line down the middle of the barrel to make the bullets fly straighter. And then after this relatively simple modernising process, those $3.50 rifles that were bought from the army are resold back to the army at $22 each. That's a 500% markup. And it's just...
That's outrageous.
It's just bizarre that anything could... It sounds like a kind of, panorama investigation into slightly dodgy...
To malpractices.
Yeah, malpractices and dodgy government contracts today. Yeah. But it was all run and funded by J.P. Morgan. He does quite a few slightly rash business deals. There's at one point a shipment of coffee, I think, comes into New Orleans Harbour, and just on a whim, he decides to buy it because it's going quite low. Just buys the boat, and and then manages barely by the skin of his teeth to sell it on at a profit. But he just sort of exactly the same as his dad in France. Grabs out his checkbook and decides that he's gonna do that.
So, but I gather that you are keen to sell another side of RJP.
So he's not all evil, cold-hearted, profiteering businessman. He's quite a romantic at heart, is RJP, because he falls in love during the Civil War, and it's really, really just so sweet. He falls in love with a girl called Amelia Sturgis, who comes from a New York family of artists, and the wedding is just so touching. She's already by this point suffering from consumption from tuberculosis quite badly, and that is it's a fatal disease at this point in time. And J.P. Morgan carries her downstairs to the wedding venue down. The wedding happens in her like family home, and he like carries her down the stairs and props her up for a minute, and then she has a nice
Aw.
sit down afterwards, and it's just so touching and cute.
But unfortunately,
Yeah, so they go on a honeymoon to Europe to take in the fresh air and try and heal her, and she dies on honeymoon 4 months later in Nice, and it's just so incredibly sad. And I think that it has a lot for JP in terms of stifling some of this sort of romantic spirit, because 3 years later he very cynically marries a woman called Frances Louisa Tracy, who he's not in love with by any stretch of the imagination. He just marries her for her money, basically. I think the common opinion is that he never really escapes Mimi, his young love, Amelia. He calls her Mimi. And in his will, he bequeaths $100,000, which is, again, quite a lot of money, to found a care home for consumptives called the Amelia Sturgis Memorial Fund. And it's just, quite a touching side. I'm just trying to introduce.
No, I mean that's one of them. But as you're the one of the two of us who's read this totemic book on JP.
Yeah, quite a lot of this is coming from a great book called The House of Morgan by Ron Chernow, I think is how you pronounce his name. And it's really, really interesting, and it basically follows how this family shaped American finance from like 1850 to the modern day.
Yeah, well. But as the person who's read up on the man, are there that many redeeming features to his character? Because from this external perspective, I see, this guy who was profiteering, who was, selling dodgy rifles, who wasn't fighting in the war.
Yeah. He was. I don't have any information to hand, but I'm almost 100% sure he was quite involved, sort of philanthropically, in particularly around New York. I'm pretty sure. But then equally, he also lived in incredible, unbelievable luxury. He had like 2 yachts that were like 400 foot long or something ridiculous, and he spent phenomenal quantities of money. He had an amazing art collection. He had 2 houses on Manhattan, 2 big houses on Manhattan, and then like another. His house in London today is an embassy, I think. So that's kind of the level of wealth that he sort of indulged himself in.
Well, I suppose we can begin discussion of his legacy once we establish what his work had been. So without further ado, do you want to take us through all the stuff with US Steel?
So 1901, America. I'm gonna give like a vague outline, the kind of feeling.
Context is king.
Context is king. America was on the up. America was feeling pretty happy about itself. It had only just a couple of years previously defeated Spain in the Spanish-American War, or the Spanish-American-Cuban War, as Cubans insist on it being called. And basically, in this particular show of American strength, the American fleet in the Pacific destroys the entire Spanish Navy, for all intents and purposes, in the course of like an afternoon. And it does it with, I think, 3 injuries of American naval sailors. No real damage to any ships, while this sort of old Spanish fleet was completely ripped.
Yeah, I mean, from that point of view, it'd be hard not to take an optimistic spin,
Yeah,
on your future as an American.
And I think that is actually a really important war, because you've got Spain, which is this setting sun. It's sort of before the British were the global superpower. It was Spain, because you think about, the conquistadors and all of the power. And this was the nation that, through Columbus, discovered America.
Well, very contentious topic.
Contentious, Vikings, etc. But, to look at it from a symbolistic point of view, and here you have the United States just trouncing them abominably in an incredibly short war.
Easily interpreted as the dawning of a new age.
Yeah, very easy. And it's interesting to see how that lines up. So you have sort of American expansionism into places like the Philippines. Everything's very hopeful. Things are on the up. You've got things aren't nearly as sort of strong from an economic perspective as they will be in the future, but America is certainly starting to make its way onto the world stage.
So back to American reasons to be cheerful in 1901.
So, well, in 1900, you have William McKinley, who, spoilers, isn't going to be around for very long, in so much as he gets assassinated next year. Isn't that fun? But he wins a landslide victory for the Republicans, sort of promising, just things continuing the way they've been going. Just upwards, onwards and upwards. Let's all be nice and optimistic about the future of America. So, one of the things that McKinley decides is going to be a good thing to do is to do more monopoly. Let's make that happen a bit more.
So monopoly in which industries?
Well, already JP Morgan actually had a hand in the monopolisation and making a trust for the railway industry and trying to make sure that all of the different firms that are building railways are not competing, but are rather working together as sort of a unified force, all in agreement where they're going and what they're doing. And when you had a perfectly... Should I do a little bit more economic explanation just for...
If you must.
So, Adam Smith, great guy, wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations.
Oh, yeah.
Where he outlines basic, sort of, the idea of a free market and sort of some very basic economic principles. So the idea and the phrase that he coined and the term that he coined was that of an invisible hand that guides markets. So what you have is a marketplace. Let's think of a physical marketplace in our minds where everyone in the marketplace is selling bread, right? So you have lots of different people, lots of different bakers, all making bread, selling it.
Yeah.
Now, as a consumer, I want to get as much bread as possible for as little money as possible. So I am going to go around the market looking at all the different bits of bread on offer, all the different bread, and I'm going to try and find the cheapest option. And this is going to cause firms to compete within the market, and they're going to become more efficient because they're going to invest their profits back into making bread more cheaply and back into making bread more efficiently.
But what about if the bread is tastier but more expensive?
I mean, that is a sort of a question of taste, but I'm not going to get into that. Just very simple.
Forget I said anything.
the cheapest bread is the best bread. Okay?
Of course,
so,
always.
Yeah, always. So the idea of this is that a free market leads to growth through reinvestment, and firms work more efficiently because they're competing with one another. They want to do the best that they can do within the marketplace. And this is sort of the key idea behind free market economics. But as far as I can tell, probably for somewhat selfish reasons, JP Morgan doesn't really subscribe to the theory of a free market. Certainly not when it comes to things like national industry, because he looks at things like the railways in the sort of 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and he sees inefficiency and waste rather than efficiency coming out of a free market system.
And that's why he gets involved in sewing them up into a trust.
Yeah, absolutely, because sort of when the markets were, for all intents and purposes, free when it came to railways, you had like 3 separate railway lines being built between Buffalo and New York, all of which did the same thing. And so there's a massive waste there of energy.
Of industry, yeah.
Yeah, and the 2 firms that built the less popular lines from Buffalo to New York are going to go bust, and it's just going to have been a massive waste of time.
And so his alternative was monopolisation.
Yeah, and he sort of believed that when it came to national industry, it was a belief that made him very rich, so maybe take it with a pinch of salt.
Yeah.
But he believed that a monopoly was better because it meant that there was no waste like there was between Buffalo and New York, and it also meant that sort of the markets could work together to make a better, rather than all competing. The markets could work together to make a better industry.
So is that what the steel industry was like, is that it was monopolised at this point? Or is this what US Steel means?
So in the US Steel is the super company, the monopoly.
Okay.
That gets put into place in
So
1901.
what was it like before US Steel?
So a lot of the reason that the steel industry is monopolised in 1901 is the way that it was sort of put together beforehand. So you had Andrew Carnegie was the steel king. He was the man that took iron ore, bought huge quantities of iron ore, owned a lot of iron mines, and turned it into steel that could then be sold on to other firms that would do the job of manufacturing the steel into finished products, things like, piping, wires, pots, pans, that kind of whatever you're making your steel into. But in 1900, Andrew Carnegie declares his intention to build new plants that are going to not only create steel, not only going to smelt steel, but they're also going to create finished products like pipes. And the problem here is that the firms that had previously done the job of creating finished products were pretty heavily invested in by JP Morgan.
Oh, okay.
So JP Morgan decides that maybe a free market in the steel industry isn't the best way to go.
So maybe losing money isn't such a good idea.
No, maybe you wouldn't like that so much. So he starts to organise, and this is going back to President McKinley. President McKinley was encouraging monopolisation of a lot of different industries because he saw it as, America was going to be the top of the world, and the best way to make American industry the most efficient in the world was to monopolise, which was sort of quite a common idea among sort of right-wing thinkers of the time. JP Morgan decides that he wants to monopolise the steel industry and merge all these separate little firms, the ones that make the piping, the ones that do the smelting, owned by Andrew Carnegie, and he wants to gather them all under one banner, US Steel, which he will, for all intents and purposes, own. So the first thing that he needs to do is go to Andrew Carnegie, who was born in Scotland, the richest man in the world at this point in time, I believe, and convince this man that he needed to sell out his share in the steel industry and sell all of his firms to Morgan in order to create a monopoly.
So this wasn't Carnegie's initiative at all. This was literally just this one man deciding that the steel industry should be so.
This one banking man, not that Carnegie particularly complained.
Yeah.
Carnegie made quite a lot of money out of it, but so they arrange a meeting, and the last thing that JP Morgan says at the end of this first meeting, which I absolutely love, he says, "Mr. Carnegie, I want to congratulate you on being the richest man in the world."
What a leaving line.
What a phenomenal line to end with. So then there's a series of, traditional, hardcore business negotiations on golf courses, obviously, because that's the kind of era that this was.
So it's easy to get sort of wrapped up in the story of it, isn't it? All these deals and these records, these fantastic conversations that people have to decide the fate of nations.
Yeah.
To get quite on board of this monopolisation of the industry. But it really wasn't that healthy a prospect, was it? With hindsight?
No. It's just so phenomenal the way that the kind of haphazard way that it comes together. Again, the sort of the one man taking it upon himself to get out his checkbook and sort everything out. So I got a great quote here from Ron Chernow's book, The House of Morgan, about how the deal actually came to be.
Yeah.
After a game of golf at St Andrew's Golf Club, Westchester, Carnegie ruminated, then penciled his selling price, $480 million, on a scrap of paper. This is the price that he's going to sell up his firms, his steel-making firms for. Morgan stared at it and said promptly, "I accept this price." Carnegie gloated over the deal. "Pierpoint feels he can do anything, because he always got the best of the Jews in Wall Street. It takes a Yankee to beat a Jew, and it takes a Scot to beat a Yankee."
So we can add to the long list of uncomfortable things you have to admit about these people.
Andrew Carnegie, anti-Semite.
Some just
terrible,
worrying
terrible human being.
racial views.
Anywho, that's not the point, because it didn't actually turn out that he did beat the Yankee, as he terms it, because he decided later on that he actually undersold his firms by about $100 million, which is a lot of money.
A hell of a lot of money.
Miss out on in the deal. And Morgan just very simply responded, "Very likely, Andrew."
Although what is $100 million to the richest man in the world?
Good point. Very good point. I think probably still quite a lot. Count the pennies and the pounds look after themselves, Sam.
So obviously it is successful. There wouldn't be a podcast happening about this merger if it wasn't successful, and very momentous too.
Yes. So Morgan gets together all these other little bits and bobs. Takes a long time. There's shouting. He's a great describes as a great brinkmanship. He's really good at brinkmanship.
Yeah.
In negotiations. So he just basically a couple of times just says, "Fine, if you're not going to join in, then I'll just do it without you." And
I suppose there's a domino effect. As well,
absolutely.
Like the more people you have on side.
So basically, once he got Carnegie on side, he was just able to go to everyone else and say, "Now Morgan's Federal Steel and Carnegie's steel interests are all gathered under one banner. You're either going to join in,
you're with us, or you're against us."
And you do not want to be against this man because he's
absolutely
very determined. So when US Steel officially comes into being, January 1901, Wall Street goes completely wild. It's unprecedented because it's just such a big company. It's valued at $1.4 billion, and it produces 67% of American steel in 1901. Which is just, those numbers are so unprecedented. Lots of people write about how daunting and how terrifying a prospect such a big company is, because it's just never been known to happen before. And with its unprecedented size, it causes a lot of hype in the markets. So on the first day that shares start being traded for US Steel, they sell 2 million shares are traded around on the stock market, which is
a lot of shares.
Guess what? It's an unprecedented number. They've never had that many shares sold in a single day, bought and sold in a single day. And the stock exchange then a week later has to announce a special holiday. It takes a Friday off just to deal with all the paperwork, because there's so much trading going on, because there's so much hype surrounding US Steel. And guess what? Stock market hype isn't always a good thing.
Yeah, by all means, especially in this day and age. Yeah. It's a very important lesson.
Yeah, I'm going to take another quote from Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. And I've no doubt that later on in this sort of series of podcasts, we come back to America? It's
quite difficult to tell us through the 20th century
without coming
America,
back to America. I expect we'll be quoting Zinn again, because, it's a pretty authoritative text on American history.
And on many a bookshelf.
And he takes a very interesting, sort of very left-wing, 60s, 70s revisionist kind of stance on lots of the perceived goods of American history. So he says about the formation of US Steel, Morgan then formed the US Steel Corporation, combining Carnegie's corporation with others. He sold stocks and bonds for $1.4 billion, about $400 million more than the combined worth of the companies, and took a fee of $150 million for arranging the consolidation. How could dividends be paid to all those stockholders and bondholders? By making sure Congress passed tariffs keeping out foreign steel, by closing off competition and maintaining the price at $28 a ton, and by working 200,000 men 12 hours a day for wages that barely kept their families alive. And it's sort of a symptom of monopolies like US Steel, that $28 a ton, because they supply 67% of the steel. They can set the price wherever they like it to be, and you've not got that many options to go somewhere else.
Yeah. Especially at this sort of dawn of the 20th century, where there are still, there's very few places to get steel on that scale.
Absolutely. So it also doesn't go that well for everyone concerned in the sort of years following 1901.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you like? It's very easy. You know, you can tell the story a number of ways. Obviously, there's all these firsts that it consists of.
Yes,
and it breaks all these records, but also it has this darker side. Like with hindsight, how does this merger hold up? Is it that big an occasion?
I'll start by saying that US Steel today in 2013 still exists and still controls a pretty hefty share of the American steel industry. So from that perspective, to consider that this is a company that has lasted now 112 years is damn impressive and
staggering.
Pretty much shows that it must have succeeded to some extent. But in the kind of direct aftermath, when everyone sort of woke up with the hangovers from the all the share buying.
The morning after the share buying before.
Teddy Roosevelt comes into power in 1902, 1903, I think. And he sets up some antitrust regulation because he wants to break up monopolies, encourage competition, that kind of thing. And he does lots of investigations into monopolies and how much the hype surrounding US Steel was, founded in actual fact. And it turns out that by Roosevelt's estimations, US Steel was actually only worth about $750 million. About half of
it's quite less than 1.6 billion, isn't it?
1.4 billion,
1.4 even, yeah.
It's about half of the asking price of all those shares that got sold. And, for a fair few years, the company was barely able to pay the dividends back to its shareholders. And for a couple of years, it seemed basically on the verge of collapse because of all the hype that was surrounded it, and then the reality that came to light. There was just this massive loss of confidence in the monopoly and its ability to do the job that it was meant to do.
So these days we are somewhat regulated in that respect. Monopolies have been securely outlawed, certainly in the Western world, sort of. A little bit.
I'm not even going to open
touchy
that.
subject.
I'm not even going to open that
but
can of worms.
Because I just think it's quite easy to look back and tell the sort of relatively quaint story of the power being in the hands of these select few, all men, and their sort of misadventures and conversations with one another and their backroom dealings.
Yeah.
But has that much changed since the age of
Yeah, certainly a lot has changed. But then you look at, I don't know, something like the energy sector in Britain today, Ed Miliband promising, getting a lot of support for promising a potential price freeze is at the end of the day another symptom of what is, for all intents and purposes, a monopoly. I mean, I'm not going to go into that much detail because this is a very touchy subject. It's current affairs. Yeah. It's all up for debate. But let's just leave it at monopolies are not entirely a thing of the past. Let's put it that way.
Dot.
But speaking of current affairs, 2013, I'd like to just take a minute to put some of these numbers into context. Because, in a world full of several $1 trillion deficits and all sorts of crazy numbers that get thrown around in the modern day and age, it's a little bit, I don't know, sometimes some of these numbers seem a little bit underwhelming. I mean, someone saying that they have £1.5 million in their bank account today obviously is not, by any stretch of the imagination, an unimpressive sum.
Yeah.
But it was earth-shatteringly large amounts of money if you sort of work out the inflation, work out what in real terms these people were worth, what in real terms US Steel as a company was worth. So if we sort of work out the vague inflation figures, that $1.4 billion that US Steel was worth in 1901, do you want to know what it equates to in today's money? It's about $43 billion.
Blimey.
Which is a lot of money. A lot of money. And, I mean, JP Morgan, back in the news quite recently, for the modern descendant of the firm, for their role in the subprime mortgage scandal. And as a result of that, they're being fined $13 billion in today's money by the FSA, I think, are fining them. And it's just they're still breaking.
Yeah, no,
they're still
I
breaking
like that.
records.
Yeah, like all these years after
It's
his
the
passing,
it's the biggest
and
fine ever rendered to a financial institution in the history of banking. $13 billion.
and I think it is something to be said that J.P. Morgan is still so called.
Yeah,
the
yeah,
company
it's-
that is, and that his achievements are still echoing in the financial
Absolutely,
structure
and
of
sort
today.
of the descendants and the direct line of from a business perspective still holds an enormous amount of sway in the financial world, especially in the kind of slightly backroom bond markets, that kind of thing. J.P. Morgan and the associated firms are just incredibly powerful even today. But again, to put everything into context, the American deficit, the total quantity of debt owed by the American government today stands at $17 trillion, just over $17 trillion, which is about 400 times the modern day value of US steel, which, everything's got to be taken with a pinch of salt. But regardless, US steel was still an unprecedented and enormously impressive financial achievement.
And one that set the tone for the financial achievements to follow.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's all for the day.
That's all for
thank
today.
you very much for listening.
Yeah, thank you very much for listening.
And at some point in the near or distant future,
There will be another episode.
1902.
1902. Any idea what 1902 is going to be about, Sam?
Well, Matt, 1902 shall be the Marquess of Salisbury's last term as British Prime Minister. He dies the year after, and I can just say, from this point of view, halfway through the research, he is a fantastically interesting man.
Good. And then I will have 1904 to look after.
Which will be?
Yes,
03, you mean?
1903 to look after, which I'm planning on doing about the Berlin-Baghdad Railway.
Which I can certainly say I know nothing about.
It's quite off the beaten track, but it is, again, really, really interesting just from some brief background reading. So, yeah.
Until then, yeah.
Thank you very much for listening.
Bye-bye.